question about what people perceive of as ethics and as bioethics. And there's been a lot of discussion recently about bioethics being in crisis, and I think there is something to be said for the idea that it is in crisis, but not for the reasons that the critics think it's in crisis. And my version of why it's in crisis is because there's so much misunderstanding of what ethics is and what bioethics is in particular. And this came out very clearly at a European workshop that Key and I attended just over a week ago in Seville, where one speaker gave a talk where she used the phrase the ethics of data protection. And in the questions afterwards, one of the participants said, "I'm sorry, I don't understand what you mean by the ethics of data protection. How can there be an ethics of data protection when you've got the rules?" And so the speaker said, well, there are always questions about whether these are the right rules and how the rules are justified. And the questioner said, "No, I'm sorry, I don't understand." And in the discussion it became very clear that many of the participants, although this was a workshop on ethics and regulation in Europe, people had no idea what ethics meant, apart from questions of the institutionalization of ethics, like the work of ethics committees. And beyond that, there are misunderstandings of bioethics in particular. So frequently, when I'm reviewing abstracts or papers, I find people talking about bioethics and saying, well, bioethics can't apply in this field, and then they go on and talk about all kinds of issues in this field which raise ethical issues. But bioethics is seen as being something different, some specific content of issues, and not, and perhaps defined in terms of one approach, which might be, for example, what Mark mentioned at the beginning as the four principles approach. So I think in thinking about what is European bioethics and the future of European bioethics, it's very important to recognize that there are these misperceptions that need to be addressed. And another key trend that's going on at the moment, in which I've done some work on myself, is the call for harmonization of ethics in Europe, not only in Europe, but certainly within Europe. And this is to allow certain things to take place, like, for example, the move towards international data sharing, not only in biobanking, but also in security issues. And these are influencing the ethics agenda. And then the final issue in relation to this is the question of value conflicts, by which I mean the sort of thing Soren was talking about, whether there are European values and how they might conflict with other sets of values if there are such sets. But I want to say something about harmonization because, as I've said, there's a lot of call for harmonization of ethics in Europe, but I think it's also important to turn that question around and ask what's the scope for variation. If we're talking about European bioethics, we need arguably to consider whether there's a sort of subtext about trying to get an agreed set of values, and it might be important to keep questioning what's the scope for variation. Now, in my work on harmonization, I've talked about harmonization as a constant interplay of voices around a text, so that one can agree on a text, which I would call a standard, that harmonization isn't unison. So it's important to maintain the difference between unison in thinking about agreement on values and harmonization and the extent to which variation is possible and desirable. And one question that the workshop we attended in Seville asked me to think about was the variation between ethics committees and the variation between ethics committees and the law. And this brings out the point again that by ethics, what was meant was institutionalized ethics rather than ethics per se. And I think it's important to disentangle the extent to which what's at issue is institutionalized ethics or ethics per se. Because what seems to get left out in some of these discussions about harmonization with Europe is going back to what the core fundamental interests are that are at stake in thinking about ethics in Europe as well as elsewhere. And as a case study, the German BMBU co-op